In the Arizona desert, an audio documentarian was about to uncover a conspiracy decades in the making. What started as a whimsical 75-cent purchase at a county tax auction took a shocking turn when she came face to face with electromagnetic anomalies that defied explanation. June Mercer wasn't your typical podcast producer. For 10 years, she had spent her life avoiding the scientific legacy her mother left behind, known for documenting places where sound behaved in impossible ways. When she encountered a coyote leading her to hidden military installations beneath the desert floor, she had no idea she was walking into a web of institutional cover-ups that had cost her mother's life. June's determination to decode her inheritance would lead to exposing a surveillance network that threatened the privacy of every American. What began as grief over a mysterious laboratory accident would become a battle against a defense contractor willing to kill to protect Cold War secrets. The high desert of Arizona would never be the same after one woman's refusal to let buried truth stay buried transformed a hidden weapon into a tool for justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's hammer struck wood with the finality of a judgment. 75 cents for a patch of desert that the plat described without irony as Vortex Lot 47C. I raised my hand higher than seemed reasonable for someone who'd driven 3 hours on a documentary podcast's shoestring budget. But there I was. June Mercer, proud new owner of 2 acres of scrub-brush and tourist mythology. The crowd around me consisted mostly of local contractors hunting for cheap building lots and a few genuine believers in Arizona's reputation for energy centers. Neither group seemed particularly invested in outbidding me for what looked like a developer's abandoned dream. The lot sat 30 miles from Sedona's Red Rocks, far enough to be worthless for spiritual tourism, but close enough to inherit the marketing. Sold to the lady with the recording equipment, the auctioneer announced. And I realized my handheld recorder had been visible the entire time. Great. Now I was that documentary person in a county where people already suspected outsiders of planning to exploit their stories. I approached the folding table where a clerk stamped my deed with the enthusiasm of someone processing a parking ticket. The document felt absurdly official for such a trivial purchase. "Congratulations," she said, sliding the paperwork across scratched plastic. "You're now the proud owner of a certified Vortex site." The way she said certified made it clear what she thought of the designation. I studied the deed more carefully, squinting at the small print in the afternoon glare. Most of it was standard legal language, but there was something else, a survey symbol stamped in the corner that made my breath catch. A circle with 3 radiating lines, like a simplified sun. I'd seen that mark before, etched into the margins of my mother's field notebooks. My mother, Dr. Elena Mercer, had been a geophysicist before she died in what the university called a laboratory accident when I was 22. She'd left me a lockbox full of reel-to-reel tapes and survey notes I'd never had the courage to decode. Now, 10 years later, here was her symbol staring back at me from a joke purchase in the Arizona desert. "Excuse me," I said to the clerk. "This survey mark, do you know what it means?" She barely glanced at the deed. "Probably just standard geological notation. The whole area was surveyed back in the 60s for mineral rights. Nothing came of it." I folded the deed carefully, noting how the older man beside me, someone who'd been bidding on various lots all morning, was watching our conversation with unusual interest. When our eyes met, he smiled with the kind of politeness that feels like a warning. "Quite a purchase," he said, extending a manicured hand. "Dr. Victor Haynes, Auradine Research. We do environmental consulting in the region." The name meant nothing to me, but something about his tone suggested it should. "June Mercer. I do audio documentaries." "How fascinating." "Podcasts?" "Sometimes. Mostly I'm interested in places where sound behaves oddly. Natural acoustics, that sort of thing." His smile deepened, though it didn't reach his eyes. And you think this particular lot might offer that? I bought it for 75 cents. If it turns out to be acoustically boring, I'm not exactly ruined. Dr. Haynes chuckled, but there was something calculating in the sound. Well, I do hope your project yields everything you're hoping for. That area has quite a history. He walked away before I could ask what he meant, leaving me holding a deed that suddenly felt heavier than it should. The drive back to my motel took me past the lot I'd just purchased. I pulled over and got out, standing at what the survey markers indicated was my eastern boundary. The land looked exactly like every other patch of high desert. Juniper and mesquite scattered across red dirt and basalt, mountain ridges wavering in the heat like mirages. But the silence was wrong. I'd spent years recording in remote locations, and I knew how desert quiet was supposed to sound. There should have been wind through the brush, distant bird calls, the subtle buzz of insects. Instead, the air seemed to swallow sound before it could travel. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the ground itself were absorbing vibration. I pulled out my handheld recorder and hit record. Day 1, lot acquisition. GPS coordinates. I rattled off the numbers, then paused. The recorder's LED was flickering oddly, and when I played back what I'd just captured, my voice sounded distant and hollow, like I was speaking through water. That's when I noticed the coyote. It stood maybe 50 yards away, near a cluster of larger rocks that might have been natural or might have been deliberately arranged. The animal watched me without the wariness I'd expect from a wild predator. When I took a step toward it, the coyote didn't retreat. It tilted its head, almost as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then it turned and trotted toward the rock cluster, disappearing behind a ridge so quickly I might have imagined the whole encounter. I walked back to my car with the deed folded in my shirt pocket and my mother's symbol burned into my memory. Whatever I'd bought for 75 cents, it wasn't just another piece of empty desert. That night, in my motel room, I finally opened the lockbox my mother had left me. I returned to the lot at dawn, carrying my mother's reel-to-reel recorder and a box of tapes I'd been avoiding for a decade. The morning light made the landscape look different, more defined, less mysterious, but the unnatural quiet persisted. Even the birds seemed reluctant to fly over my property. I'd spent half the night listening to my mother's recordings, trying to match her voice to the woman I remembered. The tapes were mostly technical. Field measurements, equipment tests, observations delivered in the clipped tone of someone who expected their work to be scrutinized. But scattered throughout were personal moments that made me understand why she'd never shared this work with me. Day 12, at coordinates 34.8219. 119876, her voice had said through the crackling speakers. The electromagnetic null effect is consistent but localized. Compasses read true north at the perimeter, then swing wildly within a 20-meter radius of the central formation. Audio equipment functions normally until entering the zone, then experiences interference that appears to stabilize rather than degrade signal. Quality. The coordinates were less than a mile from where I stood now. I walked the boundaries of my lot with her portable recorder, documenting everything. The device was a 1960s-era Nagra, heavy and professional, built when engineers expected their equipment to survive field conditions. My mother had modified it with additional shielding and custom preamps, modifications that had seemed eccentric when I was young, but now suggested she'd been working with unusual electromagnetic conditions. Recording commenced at 6:47 hours, I said, speaking into the external microphone. Initial assessment of Vortex Lot 47C. Air temperature is 68 degrees Fahrenheit, wind speed approximately 5 miles per hour from the southwest. But as I approached the center of the property, the recorder's behavior changed. The VU meters, which had been showing normal levels for my voice, began fluctuating wildly. Static crept into the headphone feed, then cleared suddenly, leaving my voice sounding more present and detailed than seemed possible. I stopped walking and played back the last 30 seconds. My words were crystal clear, every breath and footstep captured with the kind of fidelity you'd expect from a studio recording. But underneath my voice, Barely audible was something else, a rhythmic pattern that might have been interference or might have been intentional. I looked around more carefully, noting details I'd missed the previous day. The basalt formations weren't randomly scattered. They formed rough, concentric circles, with the largest stones positioned at compass points. And carved into several of the rocks, so worn by weather they were almost invisible, were the same three-line symbols that appeared on my deed and in my mother's notebooks. Someone had been here before me, someone who knew what they were looking for. I followed the pattern of stones inward, recording continuously. The Nagra's meters danced more erratically with each step, but the audio quality improved rather than degraded. By the time I reached what seemed to be the center of the formation, the recorder was capturing sounds I shouldn't have been able to hear. My heartbeat, the whisper of blood moving through my ears, the subtle creak of leather as my boots shifted. On the rocky ground, that's where I found the first concrete evidence that this place was more than tourist. Mythology, half buried under decades of sediment and rabbit brush. I discovered a brass survey marker. Not the usual stamped disc you'd find at property corners, but something more elaborate. A 6-inch medallion embossed with the same three-line symbol, surrounded by technical notations and a date, June 15th, 1963. I cleaned the marker carefully, documenting its position with GPS and photographs. The technical notations were in my mother's handwriting. Elena Mercer, Principal Investigator. I read aloud. Site designation, quiet chamber approach vector. Electromagnetic null confirmed. Recommend immediate vault consultation. Vault consultation. My mother had worked for the Army Corps of Engineers before joining the university. I'd assumed her government years involved standard geological surveys, but this suggested something more specialized. Something that required vaults and clearances, and the kind of secrecy that gets people transferred to academic positions without explanation. The coyote appeared again as I was photographing the survey marker, emerging from the same rock cluster where I'd seen it the day before. This time I was ready with the Nagra, and I managed to record its approach. On playback, the animal's footsteps were audible from impossible distances, each padfall clear and distinct against the substrate. Either the lot's acoustic properties were genuinely anomalous, or I was developing a psychological fixation on sounds that weren't really there. The coyote led me to the rock cluster, what I'd taken for natural basalt. Formations were actually carefully arranged stones, concealing something artificial. Following the animal's path, I found myself standing on a metal grate, disguised with decades of accumulated debris. The grate was maybe 3 feet square, set flush with the ground, and nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. I cleared away the camouflage and discovered that the grate covered what appeared to be an air intake. The metal was military surplus, painted in the flat green that screamed government installation, and stenciled along one edge in faded white letters, quiet chamber ventilation, authorized personnel only. My mother hadn't just surveyed this place. She'd helped build something here. I set up the Nagra next to the concealed intake and fed one of her tapes into the playback mechanism. Her voice emerged from the speakers, tinny and distant, describing electromagnetic measurements that matched what I was experiencing. But as the recording continued, something changed in the acoustic environment. The unnatural quiet deepened, as if the desert were holding its breath. And from somewhere below ground came the faintest suggestion of an echo, my mother's voice, decades old, bouncing off walls that shouldn't exist. I spent the rest of the morning following coyote tracks. The animal had left a clear trail in the sandy soil between rock formations, a path that seemed to circle the property in a deliberate pattern. Each time the tracks approached one of the carved basalt stones, they paused. Paw prints clustered as if the coyote had stopped to investigate something specific. The tracks led me to a depression I'd overlooked during my initial survey, a natural-looking dip in the landscape that could have been a dry wash or erosion pattern. But when I climbed down into it and started clearing away decades of accumulated brush and sand, I found something that made my pulse quicken. A hatch, government standard, painted the same flat green as the ventilation grate, with a locking mechanism that screamed Cold War paranoia. The thing was maybe 4 feet across, set into what appeared to be a concrete collar buried flush with the natural ground level. Someone had gone to considerable effort to hide this installation, stenciled across the hatch in block letters. Quiet chamber, authorized access only, depth of defense contract. 34A 1963, the same year as my mother's survey marker. I spent an hour trying to open the hatch with tools from my car, screwdrivers, pliers, a tire iron that proved useless against whatever locking mechanism secured the entrance. The system appeared to require either a key I didn't have or specialized tools I couldn't improvise. But during my efforts, something interesting happened with my recording equipment. The Nagra had been running continuously, documenting my attempts to access the underground installation. When I played back the audio, I could hear not just my own grunts of effort and muttered frustration, but something else, a faint, mechanical humming that seemed to come from below ground. The installation was still powered, decades after it had been sealed. I decided to test a theory that had been forming since I'd heard my mother's voice echoing from the ventilation intake. I loaded one of her oldest tapes into the Nagra and positioned the external speaker directly over the hatch. Then hit play. My mother's voice filled the desert air, describing electromagnetic readings and null field measurements. But as her words descended into whatever space lay beneath the hatch, they returned, changed. The echo that bounced back was clearer than the original recording, as if the underground chamber were not just preserving sound, but improving it. Electromagnetic null appears stable across a 20-meter radius, my mother's voice said through the speaker. And from below ground, with perfect clarity, electromagnetic null appears stable across a 20-meter radius. Then, impossibly, her voice continued from beneath the hatch, speaking words that weren't on the tape. If anyone hears this, check the ventilation intake for the key. I stared at the speaker, confirming that the tape had stopped. But my mother's voice continued from underground, growing fainter. Elena Mercer, final log. If my daughter finds this place, tell her the chamber remembers everything. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't explain while I was alive. The echo faded to silence, leaving me kneeling in the sand with a racing heart and the absolute certainty that I was either experiencing something scientifically impossible or having the kind of breakdown that runs in families. I chose to believe in the impossible. At the ventilation intake, I found what my mother's impossible echo had promised, a key, military surplus like everything else about the installation, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden inside the intake housing. The key fit the hatch lock perfectly. The mechanism turned with surprising ease, as if it had been maintained recently. When the hatch swung open, I found myself looking down a ladder that descended into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered to life automatically, illuminating what appeared to be a substantial underground facility. I grabbed my recording equipment and started down, each rung echoing metallically in the space below. The ladder was maybe 20 feet long, ending in a circular chamber lined with the kind of institutional tile that marked government construction of the 1960s. The air smelled of ozone and machine oil, tinged with the metallic scent of electronics that had been running for decades. The chamber was larger than I'd expected, maybe 30 feet across, with corridors leading in 3 directions. Industrial-grade shielding lined the walls, punctuated by observation windows and equipment panels that looked like they belonged in a nuclear facility. Everything was labeled with the same bureaucratic precision I remembered from my mother's field notes, but it was the central console that made me understand what I'd found. Banks of reel-to-reel recorders, identical to my mother's modified Nagra, lined the curved wall. Most of the machines were dark, but several were still running, their tape reels turning slowly in the artificial light. Each recorder was labeled with dates spanning from 1963 to the present, and beside them, filing cabinets marked with my mother's handwriting. I approached the nearest active recorder and read its label, Elena Mercer, Principal Investigator, Null Field Documentation, Phase 4, Recording Initiated. June 15th, 1963, duration, continuous. The machine had been running for over 60 years. I put on the monitoring headphones and listened to what it had captured. My mother's voice, young and confident, describing the construction of what she called the quiet chamber. But interwoven with her technical observations were other voices, researchers, technicians, and eventually officials who sounded increasingly concerned about what they were discovering. Electromagnetic null effect enables perfect acoustic preservation. My mother was saying through decades-old speakers. Recordings made within the chamber demonstrate no degradation over time. In fact, signal quality appears to improve, as if the environment itself were actively processing and enhancing audio information. Another voice, male and authoritative. Dr. Mercer, we need to discuss the implications of your findings. The department is concerned about security applications. My mother's voice, cooler now. The chamber is a scientific phenomenon, not a weapon. Any attempt to weaponize these effects would require extensive research that I'm not prepared to support. The authoritative voice again. I'm afraid that decision isn't yours to make. The recording continued. But the conversation shifted to coded references and oblique threats that made clear my mother had found herself in a position she couldn't control. Someone wanted to use her discovery, and she'd refused to cooperate. I was still listening when footsteps echoed from the ladder above. Someone was coming down, Miss Mercer. The voice from above carried a slight accent I couldn't place. Are you all right down there? I pulled off the monitoring headphones and looked up the ladder shaft. A man in his 40s was descending, moving with the careful confidence of someone accustomed to unfamiliar equipment. He carried a toolbox that looked like it had survived multiple deployments, and when he reached the chamber floor, I could see the kind of careful attention to detail that marked a professional engineer. I'm Amir Naderi, he said, extending a hand. People call me Miro. You interviewed me about grid-tie solar installations last year for your podcast on renewable energy transitions. I remembered him now, soft-spoken but precise. The kind of person who explained technical concepts without condescension. How did you know I was here? Your car's been parked at the lot for 2 days. County records show you as the new owner, and when I drove by this morning, I saw the hatch was open. He gestured toward the banks of recording equipment. Also, electromagnetic anomalies like this one tend to show up on my monitoring equipment. I do freelance electrical work for the rural co-op, and we've been tracking power grid fluctuations in this area for years. I studied his face, trying to gauge whether his appearance was coincidental or something more problematic. But his expression showed the kind of professional curiosity I recognized from my own work, the look of someone who'd found a puzzle worth solving. What kind of fluctuations? I asked. Power draws that don't correspond to any registered connections. Electromagnetic signatures that suggest large-scale, shielded operations. The kind of anomalies that make engineers wonder what's drawing juice from the grid without appearing on any utility maps. He approached one of the still-running recorders and examined its power connections. These machines are pulling electricity through buried cables that don't exist on any official schematic. The recording I'd been listening to was still playing through the chamber's speakers. Miro tilted his head, listening to my mother's decades-old voice describing electromagnetic measurements. Elena Mercer, he said. I knew that name. She published some papers on electromagnetic null effects in the Journal of Applied Geophysics back in the 80s. Theoretical stuff mostly. But there were rumors in the engineering community that she'd found something practical in the military classified. She was my mother, Miro's. Expression shifted from professional interest to something more careful. I'm sorry. I heard about the lab accident. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's what they called it. I gestured toward the filing cabinets. But I'm starting to think there was more to her death than equipment failure. We spent the next hour exploring the chamber systematically. What I'd initially taken for a single circular room was actually part of a larger complex. The 3 corridors led to additional chambers, each one specialized for different types of recording and measurement. One room contained seismographic equipment that was still monitoring ground vibrations. Another held atmospheric sensors tracking barometric pressure, humidity, and electromagnetic field strength. The 3rd corridor led to what appeared to be a workshop where electronic equipment could be modified and tested, but it was the main recording chamber that held the most revelatory material. The filing cabinets contained decades of documentation, meticulously organized according to my mother's methodical habits. I found folders labeled by date, subject, and security classification, many marked with stamps I'd never seen before, eyes only, compartmentalized access, and most frequently, Project Quiet. Project Quiet was the code name, I said, reading through a folder dated 1965. They were studying what they called electromagnetic null phenomena for potential military applications. Miro examined some of the technical diagrams. This is sophisticated stuff. Look at these shielding specifications. They built this place to isolate electromagnetic signals from outside interference while preserving everything that happened inside. I pulled out another folder, this one containing correspondence between my mother and various government officials. The tone of the exchanges grew increasingly tense over time, with my mother expressing concerns about the ethical implications of the research and officials pressuring her to continue without asking uncomfortable questions. "Listen to this," I said, reading from a letter dated June 1967. "Dr. Mercer, your reluctance to continue development of practical applications for the null effect is noted and regrettable. The department's investment in Project Quiet requires concrete results. Your cooperation in developing signal preservation and enhancement capabilities is not optional." "Signal preservation and enhancement," Miro repeated. "That explains why this place has been running for 60 years. They weren't just studying the electromagnetic anomaly. They were using it to create a perfect recording environment." I found my mother's response to the pressure campaign in another folder. "The null effect preserves information with unprecedented fidelity, but weaponizing this capability would fundamentally compromise the scientific integrity of our work. I cannot in good conscience develop surveillance applications for phenomena that could serve legitimate research purposes." The correspondence ended abruptly in 1968, with a terse notation that Dr. Elena Mercer had been transferred to academic positions pending security review, but the recording equipment had kept running. I loaded a tape from 1969 into one of the playback units. My mother's voice emerged from the speakers, but she was no longer describing technical measurements. Instead, she was speaking directly to someone she expected might find the recordings years later. "If anyone discovers this chamber, you need to understand what you're dealing with. The electromagnetic null doesn't just preserve recordings, it seems to enhance them, extracting information from signals that should be degraded or lost. The implications are extraordinary, but they're also dangerous in the wrong hands." Her voice continued, "I've been ordered to develop practical applications for what they're calling enhanced surveillance capabilities. The idea is that recordings made in null environments could be processed to recover conversations, communications, and other audio information that would normally be impossible to retrieve. It's not quite telepathy, but it's close enough to terrify anyone who understands the privacy implications." Miro and I exchanged glances. "She was describing a perfect surveillance system," he said quietly. "A way to record and enhance audio information with unprecedented clarity and detail, and she refused to develop it," I added. "That's why they transferred her out of the program," My mother's recorded voice continued, "I've sealed the chamber and disabled the primary recording systems, but the null effect itself will persist. If the right person finds this place, they could continue the research in a more ethical direction. But if the wrong people gain access, the recording cut off abruptly, leaving us in silence, broken only by the hum of electronic equipment. We need to document everything," I said, "before someone else finds this place and decides to finish what they started." That's when we heard footsteps. On the ladder above, Dr. Victor Haynes descended into the chamber with the careful precision of someone who'd been here before. Behind him came a younger man whose bearing screamed security contractor, alert eyes, hands that moved automatically to check exits, the kind of controlled tension that suggested he was armed. "Ms. Mercer," Dr. Haynes said, his voice carrying the same polite authority I'd heard at the auction. "I was hoping we could resolve this situation before it became complicated." I stood up from the filing cabinet I'd been examining, acutely aware that Miro and I were potentially trapped 20 feet underground with people whose intentions were unclear. "Dr. Haynes, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. I suspect you weren't expecting to see me at all." He gestured toward the recording equipment and open files. "May I introduce Dax McAlpin, our field safety coordinator? We represent Auradine Research, and I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about your property purchase." The security contractor, McAlpin, remained near the ladder, positioned to control our exit. He hadn't spoken, but his presence communicated volumes about how serious Haynes considered this situation. "What kind of misunderstanding?" I asked. Haynes pulled a leather portfolio from his jacket and extracted several official-looking documents. "The land you purchased at auction is subject to a federal environmental easement dating from 1963. While you technically own the surface rights, any subsurface installations remain under federal jurisdiction." I examined the paperwork he offered. It looked legitimate, proper seals, official letterhead, legal language that made my eyes glaze over. But something about the documents felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what. "Environmental easement," I repeated. "For what kind of environmental issue?" "Electromagnetic contamination," Haynes said smoothly. "The installation you've discovered was part of a Cold War-era research program that created localized electromagnetic anomalies. For public safety reasons, the site was sealed and placed under federal oversight." Miro stepped forward, examining the documents with the careful attention of someone accustomed to permits and regulations. "These easement papers are dated last week," he said quietly. "But you're claiming the easement dates from 1963. Haynes's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the chamber. "The original easement was classified. Recent declassification has allowed us to file proper documentation with county authorities." "Convenient timing," I said. "Right after I purchased the land and discovered the installation. Ms. Mercer, I understand your suspicion, but you need to consider the broader implications here." Haynes gestured toward the banks of recording equipment. "This facility contains technology that could be extremely dangerous if misused. The electromagnetic effects that preserve these recordings could also be used to disrupt communications, navigation systems, or other critical infrastructure." I thought about my mother's recordings, her concern about surveillance applications, and the ethical implications of enhanced audio recovery. "So you're claiming this is a matter of national security?" "I'm claiming this is a matter of public safety," Haynes corrected. "Auradine has been monitoring this site for years, ensuring that the electromagnetic anomalies remain stable and contained. Your unauthorized access has potentially destabilized systems that have been carefully maintained for decades." McAlpin finally spoke, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ma'am, we need you to gather your equipment and exit the facility immediately. This site will be secured pending a full safety assessment. And if I refuse?" Haynes sighed with the air of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Ms. Mercer, you purchased surface rights to 2 acres of desert. You did not purchase the right to access federal installations, compromise ongoing research, or endanger public safety by tampering with equipment you don't understand. I looked around the chamber, taking inventory of what I'd discovered. My mother's files, decades of recordings, evidence of a research program that had been hidden for 60 years. If I allowed Haynes and his people to secure the site, all of this would disappear again. I need time to collect my mother's personal effects, I said. Surely you can understand that this material has sentimental value. Haynes consulted his watch with the air of someone making a generous concession. 30 minutes. Mr. McAlpin will assist you in identifying items that are safe to remove. It was a negotiation disguised as an ultimatum, but it gave me something to work with. I started gathering files and tapes, while Miro began documenting the chamber's technical specifications with his phone camera. McAlpin watched us carefully, but he seemed more interested in ensuring we didn't damage equipment than in preventing us from recording what we saw. That's when I noticed something odd about the chamber's acoustics. Our conversation was being recorded by the automatic systems, but the playback that echoed from the speakers was subtly different from what we'd actually said. Words were clearer, background noise was filtered out, and emotional undertones were somehow enhanced. The chamber wasn't just preserving our voices, it was analyzing and improving them. Dr. Haynes, I said, speaking directly toward one of the microphone arrays, can you explain why Auradine has been monitoring a site that was supposedly sealed for public safety? His answer came back through the speakers with perfect clarity. We have ongoing research contracts that require periodic assessment of electromagnetic anomalies. But underneath his official response, the enhanced audio picked up something else, a faint tension that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. I tried another question. What happened to my mother after she was transferred out of Project Quiet? This time, Haynes's response was more guarded. Dr. Mercer continued her research in academic settings, focusing on theoretical applications rather than practical development. But the chamber's enhanced playback revealed the hesitation in his voice, the slight pause that suggested he knew more about my mother's fate than he was willing to admit. I was still processing the implications when Sheriff Tamsin Ortega's voice echoed down the ladder shaft. Dr. Haynes, Ms. Mercer? I need everyone to come up here now. Sheriff Ortega stood beside her patrol car with the patient expression of someone who'd dealt with territorial disputes before. She was maybe 50, with the kind of weathered competence that came from years of mediating between federal authorities, local interests, and the occasional tourist who'd wandered into situations they didn't understand. I've got reports of unauthorized access to federal property, she said as we emerged from the chamber. I've also got reports of federal personnel operating without proper local coordination. Somebody want to explain what's happening here? Haynes immediately shifted into the kind of smooth authority that worked on people who weren't accustomed to being lied to professionally. Sheriff Ortega, I'm Dr. Victor Haynes from Auradine Research. We're responding to a potential public safety issue involving electromagnetic contamination. Ortega's expression suggested she'd heard similar explanations before. And Ms. Mercer, you're the new property owner? I bought the land at a county tax auction, I said, showing her the deed, for 75 cents. I was exploring my property when I discovered the underground installation. 75 cents. Ortega examined the deed carefully. That's unusual even for tax lien sales. Most remote lots go for at least a few $100s. Haynes interjected smoothly. The low sale price reflects the environmental restrictions on the property. Federal easements make the land unsuitable for development or private use. About those easements, Ortega said, I'd like to see the original documentation. County records show no federal restrictions on this parcel. The easements were classified until recently, Haynes explained. Declassification has allowed us to file proper documentation, but there may be a delay in updating county records. Ortega's expression grew more skeptical. Dr. Haynes, I've been sheriff in this county for 12 years. Federal agencies that operate classified installations don't typically forget to file environmental easements. They tend to be pretty thorough about protecting their interests. Sheriff, I assure you, I'm sure you do. But until I see proper federal documentation, authenticated through appropriate channels, I'm treating this as a civil dispute over property rights. She turned to me. Miss Mercer, I recommend you contact the county clerk's office and request a title search. If there are legitimate federal interests in this property, they'll show up in the official records. McAlpin stepped forward with the kind of controlled movement that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being overruled by local law enforcement. Sheriff, this facility contains equipment that poses potential safety hazards. We need to secure the site immediately. Mr. McAlpin, is it? You'll need to provide documentation of specific safety violations before I can authorize site closure. General claims about electromagnetic contamination don't meet the threshold for emergency action. I could see Haynes calculating his options, weighing the risks of escalation against the possibility of losing control of the situation. But before he could respond, another car pulled up to the lot. A county vehicle with official plates. Marisol Vega stepped out of the car carrying a box of files that looked like they'd been pulled from deep storage. She was younger than I'd expected from her voice on the phone, maybe 30, with the kind of systematic attention to detail that made her invaluable in a records office. Sheriff Ortega, she called. I brought those property documents you requested. Marisol's our county record specialist, Ortega explained to the group. I asked her to pull the complete file on this parcel going back to the original territorial surveys. Marisol set her box on the hood of her car and began extracting folders. This is interesting, she said, spreading documents across the metal surface. The property has changed hands multiple times since the 1960s, but there's something unusual about the transfer patterns. She held up several deeds, comparing dates and signatures. Look at this sequence. The land was originally surveyed in 1962 as part of a federal mineral rights assessment. Then it was sold to a private research consortium in 1963, the same year that underground facility was constructed. But in 1968, ownership reverted to the federal government through eminent domain proceedings. And after that, Ortega asked, this is where it gets weird. Starting in 1970, the property was transferred between various shell companies and holding corporations every 3 to 5 years, always for nominal amounts, usually less than $100. Like someone was playing hot potato with toxic land. Haynes had gone very still, his earlier confidence replaced by careful attention to what Marisol was revealing. The most recent transfer was in 2019, Marisol continued. From something called Quiet Holdings LLC to the county for tax default. That's why it showed up at the auction. I studied the documents she'd laid out. Quiet Holdings. That's a reference to Project Quiet, the research program my mother worked on. Project Quiet. Marisol looked intrigued. I've seen that name in other files. There's a whole series of mineral rights and easement filings from the 1960s that reference various quiet designations. Most of them were sealed by federal order, but a few remained in the open files. She pulled out another folder. Here's something interesting. Environmental impact assessments filed in 1967 for Project Quiet Phase 2. The documents describe plans to expand electromagnetic research facilities across multiple sites in Arizona and New Mexico. Phase 2? I asked. According to these filings, the original installation was just a prototype. They planned to build a network of similar facilities, all connected through some kind of electromagnetic relay system. Marisol consulted her notes. But the project was terminated in 1968, right around the time your mother was transferred out of the program. Haynes finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Miss Vega, I believe some of those documents may be classified. Federal records from that era often contain sensitive information that requires special handling. These documents are part of the public record. Dr. Haynes, filed with the county and never classified or sealed. Marisol's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what paperwork she was entitled to access. If there are federal restrictions on this information, they would have been noted in the filings. Sheriff Ortega had been studying the deeds and transfer documents with growing interest. Dr. Haynes, these records suggest a pattern of deliberate obfuscation regarding ownership and federal interests in this property. Can you explain why Auradine Research would claim easement rights that don't appear in any official documentation? Sheriff, there may be classified aspects of this situation that require coordination with federal authorities. Dr. Haynes. Ortega's voice carried the kind of finality that ended negotiations. Unless you can provide authenticated federal documentation establishing legal authority over this property, I'm treating this as a civil matter. Ms. Mercer owns the land, and she has the right to access installations on her property. This is a mistake, Sheriff. The equipment in that facility is potentially dangerous. Then, you'll need to file proper safety violation reports through official channels. Until then, I'm not authorizing any site closure or access restrictions. Haynes and McAlpin exchanged glances, and I could see them recalculating their approach. They'd expected to intimidate a naive podcast producer into surrendering something she didn't understand. Instead, they were facing a sheriff who knew bureaucratic procedure and a records clerk who'd uncovered 6 decades of suspicious paperwork. "Sheriff," I said, "I'd like to continue documenting what I found in the facility. Some of the material relates to my mother's research, and I believe it may have bearing on her death." "Your mother's death?" Ortega's attention sharpened. "What kind of bearing?" I looked directly at Haynes as I answered. My mother was transferred out of Project Quiet in 1968 after refusing to develop surveillance applications for the electromagnetic research. She died in a laboratory accident in 1981, but the circumstances were never fully explained. Ms. Mercer, I think you're reading too much into coincidental. Dr. Haynes, I interrupted. Did you know my mother personally? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He hesitated for a moment too long before answering. I may have encountered her work in professional contexts, but his hesitation had been enough. Marisol was already pulling another folder from her box. "Elena Mercer," she said, consulting an index sheet. "I cross-referenced that name when I was pulling the property files. Dr. Haynes, you're listed as co-author on several papers with Dr. Mercer in the late 1970s, publications on electromagnetic field effects and signal processing applications." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Haynes had just been caught in a direct lie, and everyone present knew it. "I think," said Sheriff Ortega, "we all need to sit down and have a more detailed conversation about what's really happening here." Professor Lila Redbird arrived as the sun was setting, driving a pickup truck that had seen better decades, but still ran with the determined reliability of well-maintained machinery. She approached our impromptu conference at the chamber entrance with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read situations before committing to them. "Sheriff Ortega," she said, nodding to the group. "I got your message about potential cultural heritage issues at this site." Ortega had called the university after Marisol discovered references to indigenous consultation protocols in some of the Project Quiet documentation. Professor Redbird taught in the astronomy department, but her real expertise was in ethnoecology, the intersection of traditional knowledge and scientific research. "Professor Redbird," Ortega said. "This is June Mercer, the property owner, and Dr. Victor Haynes from Auradine Research. We've got competing claims about federal interests in an underground installation, and I wanted your perspective on the cultural implications." Lila studied the chamber entrance and the exposed ventilation systems with the kind of systematic attention I recognized from my mother's field habits. "This area has significance in several tribal traditions," she said finally. "What you're calling a vortex site corresponds to places that have been recognized for centuries as having unusual properties." "Unusual how?" I asked, acoustically primarily. "Places where sound carries differently, where echoes behave in ways that don't match the visible terrain. Traditional stories describe these locations as places where words spoken in the past can sometimes be heard in the present. Haynes looked skeptical. "Professor, while I respect indigenous traditions, we're dealing with measurable electromagnetic phenomena here. Scientific instruments, not folklore." Lila's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but I caught the flash of annoyance in her eyes. "Dr. Haynes, traditional knowledge represents thousands of years of systematic observation. When indigenous communities describe unusual acoustic properties at specific locations, it's worth taking those observations seriously." She approached the chamber entrance and knelt to examine the concealed ventilation systems. "The way these installations are positioned suggests someone was trying to work with the natural properties of the site rather than against them. That's consistent with traditional approaches to place-based phenomena." "Dr. Redbird," I said, "I've found evidence that this installation was built to study and potentially exploit those acoustic properties. The research seems to have been aimed at developing surveillance applications. That concerns me." Lila stood up and brushed dust from her hands. "There's a long history of indigenous knowledge being appropriated for military and commercial purposes without consultation or consent. If this installation was built to weaponize phenomena that have cultural significance—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. "What kind of consultation should have happened?" Miro asked. "At minimum, any research involving culturally significant sites should include community representatives in the planning process. More importantly, communities should have control over how their traditional knowledge is used and shared." Haynes shifted uncomfortably. "Professor, this is a federal installation built on federal land in the 1960s. Contemporary consultation protocols wouldn't have applied." "Dr. Haynes, indigenous communities have been here for thousands of years. The fact that the federal government chose to ignore traditional land use and knowledge systems in the 1960s doesn't make that approach ethically acceptable." Sheriff Ortega had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "Professor Redbird, are there specific tribal authorities we should be consulting about this site? Several communities have traditional connections to this area. But more immediately, I think we need to consider what happens to the information that's been preserved in this installation." Lila looked directly at me. "Ms. Mercer, you mentioned that the chamber contains decades of recordings. What are your plans for that material?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on uncovering what my mother had discovered and protecting it from Haynes's attempts at suppression that I hadn't considered the broader implications of preservation and access. "I want to understand what happened to my mother," I said. "But beyond that, you'll be making decisions about information that was gathered without community consent and preserved using technology that exploits culturally significant phenomena," Lila said gently. "Those decisions have ethical implications." Haynes seized on her words. "Professor Redbird raises important points about the responsible handling of sensitive information. This is exactly why Auradine believes the site should remain under professional oversight rather than private control." "Dr. Haynes," Lila said, her voice carrying new steel, "I wasn't suggesting that institutional control is the solution. I was suggesting that community control might be more appropriate than either private or corporate. Management." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple trucks with equipment trailers, and the kind of organized movement that suggested an operation rather than a visit. McAlpin immediately moved to a position where he could observe the new arrivals while maintaining visual contact with our group. "Dr. Haynes," he said quietly, "we've got company." 3 trucks pulled up to the lot, each one carrying equipment I didn't recognize, but that looked official and expensive. Men in matching utility clothing began unloading surveying gear, electromagnetic measurement devices, and portable barriers marked with radiation warning symbols. "Sheriff," Haynes said, his tone becoming more urgent, I'm afraid we may have a developing safety situation. These are emergency response specialists from our hazmat division." Ortega watched the equipment deployment with obvious suspicion. "Dr. Haynes, I wasn't notified of any hazmat concerns. You'll need to provide documentation of specific contamination before I can authorize site closure." One of the hazmat specialists approached our group, carrying a radiation detection device that was clicking ominously. "Sir," he addressed Haynes, "we're reading elevated electromagnetic fields across the entire site. Recommend immediate civilian evacuation pending containment assessment." The timing was too convenient, the threat too perfectly tailored to justify exactly the kind of emergency closure that would remove all of us from the site and allow Auradine to secure the chamber without further interference. "Professor Redbird," I said, "can electromagnetic fields pose health risks?" "Certain types of electromagnetic radiation can be dangerous," she said carefully, "but the levels required to justify immediate evacuation would typically be detectable with standard equipment." Miro pulled out his multimeter and began taking readings from various locations around the site. "I'm not seeing anything unusual," he announced. "Electromagnetic signatures are well within normal ranges." The hazmat specialist looked annoyed. "Sir, our equipment is calibrated for this specific type of contamination. Civilian instruments wouldn't detect the particular frequency signatures we're monitoring." "What frequencies?" Miro asked. The specialist hesitated, clearly not expecting technical questions from civilians. "Classified frequency ranges associated with military research applications." Sheriff Ortega had heard enough. "Dr. Haynes, I'm going to need authenticated documentation of these safety concerns before I authorize any emergency measures. Until then, this site remains under Ms. Mercer's control as the legal owner." That's when McAlpin made his move. I waited until 3 a.m. to make my move, when the desert cold would make the Auradine security team less alert and more focused on staying warm than watching for infiltration. Miro met me at a wash half a mile from my property, carrying a backpack full of electronics wrapped in custom Faraday pouches. "You sure about this?" he asked, checking the handheld spectrum analyzer that would help us avoid their perimeter sensors. "My mother died protecting what's in that chamber. I won't let them bury it." We approached from the north, moving through terrain too rough for vehicles, staying low and avoiding the obvious paths that would be monitored. The Auradine team had set up floodlights around the main approaches, but they'd left gaps in their coverage, probably confident that anyone trying to access the site would use the established trails. The concealed hatch was 50 yards from the nearest security position, hidden in the depression that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. But getting there meant crossing open ground under starlight bright enough to cast shadows. "Motion sensors active along the eastern perimeter," Miro whispered, reading his equipment. "But there's a dead zone near the rock cluster where the coyote disappeared." We used that gap, moving in short dashes between cover until we reached the rim of the depression. The hatch was exactly as I'd left it, but fresh footprints in the sand suggested someone had been here recently. I climbed down and opened the entrance, while Miro kept watch. The emergency lighting activated as before, but something felt different about the chamber. The air circulation system was running harder, as if compensating for additional load, and some of the monitoring equipment showed activity patterns I hadn't seen before. "Someone's been down here," I said as Miro descended the ladder. "Recently." He pulled out a handheld scanner and swept it across the chamber. Fresh electromagnetic signatures, consistent with portable recording equipment. Professional grade. We moved quickly through the facility, documenting everything with digital cameras, while Miro's Faraday pouches protected the memory cards from any interference. The master console was still running, but several tape reels had been removed from their storage positions and hastily replaced. They've been copying the recordings, I realized, taking what they need while maintaining the appearance that nothing's been disturbed. In the central archive, we found evidence of systematic documentation. File cabinets had been photographed, individual tapes catalogued, and specific recordings flagged with colored tabs. Someone had spent considerable time down here, methodically inventorying 30 years of preserved audio, but they'd missed something behind the master console. In a space barely wide enough for the cables that ran there, I found a metal box welded to the structural frame. My mother's handwriting on the side: June, emergency backup, key under third stone east. The third stone from the eastern wall held a small cavity underneath, and in that cavity, a key that fit the welded box perfectly. Inside, a single reel of tape. Labeled in my mother's hand, Elena Mercer, final testimony, June 1989, the complete truth. June, Miro said urgently from across the chamber. We've got company. Footsteps echoed from the ladder shaft. Multiple people, moving with the professional, quiet of security contractors, who knew how to approach a potentially hostile situation. I grabbed the tape reel and stuffed it into one of Miro's Faraday pouches, just as McAlpin's voice called down from above. Miss Mercer, you're trespassing on a federal crime scene. Come up slowly with your hands visible. It's my property, I called back, though I was already looking for alternative exits, not as of 4 hours ago. Emergency seizure order was signed at 11 p.m. You're now in violation of federal environmental protection statutes. Miro pointed toward one of the side corridors. In the original construction plans I'd studied, it led to a secondary ventilation shaft that might provide another way out. But reaching it would mean leaving the main chamber and its perfect acoustic properties. The backup recordings, I whispered. If they get control of this facility, they can destroy everything. Not if we get the truth out first. McAlpin appeared at the bottom of the ladder, followed by 2 other men in tactical gear. All of them were armed, though they kept their weapons lowered in a show of professional restraint. Ma'am, I need you to step away from the equipment and move toward the exit. Instead, I moved toward the master console and began loading my mother's final tape into the playback system. If I was going to be arrested, at least I could ensure someone heard what she died trying to preserve. Step away from the console, Ms. Mercer. This tape contains evidence of murder and federal conspiracy. I have a right to. McAlpin moved faster than I expected, crossing the chamber in 3 strides and grabbing my arm before I could start the playback. But in the electromagnetic null of the chamber, his radio equipment malfunctioned, cutting off his communication with the surface team. Let her play it, Miro said quietly. You're going to want to hear what's on that tape before you decide what to do next. McAlpin hesitated, recognizing that whatever we'd found might change the nature of his orders. After a moment, he released my arm, but stayed close enough to intervene if I tried anything he considered threatening. I started the tape. My mother's voice filled the chamber, clearer than it had ever been on the degraded recordings I'd heard before. This was her final testimony, recorded in perfect acoustic conditions and preserved for 30 years. In the null field that made lies impossible and truth permanent. Sheriff Ortega's patrol car arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes before the emergency hearing, giving me just enough time to test the portable playback system Miro had rigged to work with the courtroom's sound equipment. The tape from my mother's emergency backup had survived 30 years of storage, but it would only get one chance to tell its story to the people who could act on what it revealed. Dr. Haynes sat at the plaintiff's table with a legal team that probably cost more than most people's houses, projecting the calm confidence of someone who'd navigated federal bureaucracy long enough to know which buttons to push. Across the aisle, I had Marisol's documents, Lila's cultural preservation petition, and a reel-to-reel tape that contained my mother's dying declaration. Judge Patricia Morrison had agreed to hear arguments on the emergency seizure order, but she'd made clear that her patience for conspiracy theories and family grievances was limited. The federal environmental protection statutes Auradine was invoking carried significant legal weight, and my claims of fraud and cover-up would need substantial evidence to overcome institutional presumptions. Ms. Mercer, Judge Morrison said, You have 30 minutes to present your case for why this emergency order should be vacated. I stood at the plaintiff's table, noting how Dr. Haynes was watching me with the polite attention of someone waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. Behind him, McAlpin sat with the other Auradine personnel, all of them projecting professional competence and barely concealed impatience, Your Honor. The emergency seizure order is based on fraudulent documentation and fabricated environmental data. The plaintiff, Auradine Research, has systematically used forged federal claims to acquire properties throughout this county, and the supposed environmental hazards they cite don't exist. I gestured to Marisol, who approached the bench with boxes of documents. County Records Clerk Marisol Vega will present evidence showing that Auradine's federal environmental review was filed after my property purchase was completed, using backdated signatures and falsified case numbers. For the next 15 minutes, Marisol methodically dismantled Auradine's paper trail, showing the court exactly how Federal Environmental Authority had been fabricated to create retroactive claims on legitimately purchased property. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly stern as the pattern of fraud became undeniable. Dr. Haynes, the judge said, would you care to explain these discrepancies in your filing dates and authorization signatures? Haynes rose smoothly, his demeanor unchanged despite having his documentation exposed as fraudulent. Your Honor, I believe there may be some confusion about the complex interagency procedures involved in environmental protection cases. The apparent inconsistencies Ms. Vega has identified reflect the realities of federal coordination, not deliberate misrepresentation. Backdated signatures reflect federal coordination. Administrative corrections to ensure proper documentation of legitimate environmental concerns. The substance of our petition remains valid. The site poses genuine risks that require immediate professional oversight. Judge Morrison studied the documents again, clearly frustrated by the bureaucratic complexity Haynes was using as cover. Ms. Mercer, do you have additional evidence to support your fraud allegations? This was the moment I'd been preparing for since discovering the chamber. Your Honor, I have a recording made by my mother, Dr. Elena Mercer, 3 days before her death in 1989. It documents her involvement in the research project that Auradine is now trying to conceal, and it provides direct evidence of the conspiracy that led to her murder. Haynes' calm finally cracked. Objection, Your Honor. This is exactly the kind of family grievance and conspiracy theorizing that has no place in environmental protection proceedings. Your Honor, I continued, this recording was made in the facility that Auradine claims is environmentally hazardous. If their environmental concerns were legitimate, this evidence couldn't exist. The fact that it survived for 30 years proves their contamination claims are false. Judge Morrison considered this logic. I'll allow the recording, but keep it brief and relevant to the environmental claims at issue. I nodded to Miro, who activated the playback system. My mother's voice filled the courtroom with perfect clarity, describing her work on what she called the Quiet Chamber Project, and the pressure she was receiving from unnamed officials to weaponize her acoustic research. But it was her final statement that changed everything. June, if you're hearing this, then they succeeded in silencing me. But they couldn't silence the chamber itself. Every conversation, every meeting, every decision made within the null field is preserved permanently, including the conversations where Dr. Victor Haynes admitted that the environmental contamination claims were fabricated to create pretexts for site seizures. Haynes shot to his feet. This is inadmissible hearsay from 30 years ago, but my mother's voice continued. Dr. Haynes, recording date June 17, 1989, confirming that radiation readings and soil contamination data can be fabricated as needed to justify emergency federal authority. Quote, the beauty of environmental protection statutes is that they allow immediate action based on potential rather than proven hazards. We can seize any site we need by simply generating the appropriate documentation. The courtroom was absolutely silent as my mother's preserved recording played back a conversation that proved the current environmental seizure order was part of a 30-year pattern of fraud. Judge Morrison's gavel hit the bench with finality. Emergency seizure order vacated. Dr. Haynes, you and your organization will report to the county attorney's office tomorrow morning to address these allegations of document fraud. Ms. Mercer, your property rights are restored pending full investigation of these claims. As the court session ended, I watched Dr. Haynes gather his legal materials with hands that weren't quite steady. 30 years of careful institutional control had been undone by my mother's voice, speaking truth from beyond the grave through the perfect preservation system she died protecting. 6 months later, I stood at the edge of my property, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red. The legal battles were mostly finished. Orodine's contracts had been revoked. Dr. Haynes was facing federal fraud charges, and the systematic land acquisition scheme had been exposed and shut down. But more importantly, the chamber itself had found a new purpose. Professor Lila Redbird approached from the direction of the new visitors' center, carrying the kind of satisfied expression that comes from seeing justice properly served. The Tribal Council's cultural preservation petition had been approved, creating joint stewardship between my ownership and traditional knowledge holders who understood the site's deeper significance. The first group of researchers arrives next week, she said. Acoustic physicists from 3 universities, plus a delegation from the Smithsonian's Native American Cultural Preservation Program. All cleared through the Tribal Council. All cleared. No military applications, no intelligence agency access, no commercial exploitation. Pure research, with results published openly and any benefits shared equitably. We walked toward the chamber entrance, which was no longer hidden but wasn't advertised either. A simple bronze plaque marked it as a cultural preservation site and active research facility, protected under both federal cultural landmark statutes and private conservation easements. Sheriff Ortega's patrol car crested the ridge, making her weekly check on the site. She'd become something of a folk hero in the county after her role in exposing the Orodine fraud became public, and she wore the attention with the same practical competence she brought to everything else. Evening, ladies. Everything quiet out here? Appropriately quiet, I said, and she laughed. Ortega had been the first law enforcement officer to hear my mother's complete testimony, and she'd used it to build cases against 17 other fraudulent land seizures across the region. Marisol estimated that Orodine's systematic theft had cost individual property owners more than $2 million over 20 years. Any word from the federal investigation? Lila asked. Haynes is cooperating fully, which means he's giving up everyone above him in the food chain. Turns out the chamber wasn't the only site they've been suppressing. There's a whole network of anomalous locations that have been hidden from public knowledge for decades. As Ortega drove away, Miro emerged from the chamber carrying equipment cases and the satisfied expression of someone who'd spent the day solving interesting technical problems. The preservation system is running perfectly, he reported. All of your mother's recordings have been digitized and backed up, but the originals remain in the null field for absolute preservation. We've also started documenting the acoustic properties themselves. This technology could revolutionize everything from data storage to archaeological preservation, as long as it's used ethically. That's why we have the Oversight Committee. Every research proposal gets reviewed by the Tribal Council, the University Ethics Board, and a Community Representative Committee. No one person or organization can control access to what's down there. I walked the perimeter of my property as the stars emerged, following the same path the coyote had shown me 6 months earlier. The animal still appeared occasionally, usually at dusk, watching the new activity. With the same patient attention it had shown when I was the only person who knew the chamber existed, tonight it materialized, near the rock cluster, where I'd first discovered the ventilation intake. sitting calmly while I approached. "Thank you," I said to it, feeling only slightly ridiculous for talking to a wild animal, "for showing me what I needed to find." The coyote tilted its head, listening to something I couldn't hear, then trotted away into the desert darkness. I returned to the chamber entrance and descended into the space my mother had helped create, where her voice still echoed from the walls, with perfect clarity, and the null field preserved every truth that entered its boundaries. In the central console room, I loaded the tape player with one of my own recordings, a documentary episode I'd produced about the chamber, the cover-up, and the community of people who'd worked together to transform a hidden surveillance facility into a tool for cultural preservation and ethical research. My voice filled the chamber, joining the permanent acoustic record that would preserve it for future generations. This is June Mercer, reporting from the Quiet Chamber Preservation Facility. Today marks 6 months since the community reclaimed this space from institutional control, and it's become something my mother never could have imagined. Not a weapon or a tool of surveillance, but a place where truth is preserved and shared openly. I paused, listening to the chamber's perfect silence absorb my words and hold them permanently in its electromagnetic embrace. My mother, Dr. Elena Mercer, died believing that some knowledge was too dangerous for institutional control. She was right, but she also believed that the truth, properly preserved and ethically shared, could serve justice rather than power. The chamber she helped create has become proof that even the most dangerous knowledge can be transformed into something that serves the common good. The recording continued, but I climbed back to the surface, leaving my words to join the permanent archive of voices that spoke truth to power and won. Above ground, the desert stretched endlessly under stars that had watched this landscape for millennia. My 75-cent purchase had become something worth more than money, a space where silence served truth, where the past spoke to the present, and where the future could learn from voices that refused to be silenced. The chamber would continue its work, preserving truth for generations not yet born, in the quiet spaces where lies cannot survive and justice echoes forever. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.